Thank you very much, Monty, and welcome to all of you this afternoon to our inaugural lecture, as Monty has mentioned. And thank you very much, High Commissioner, for being with us this afternoon for this very special occasion. I think what you have to say today is not only of great interest to everyone here in terms of India, its promise and potential, but also in terms of the bilateral relationship, because India is extremely important to Canada and is a priority country for the government. I think I mentioned before that Kate and I were posted in India in the early 1970s, and we returned some 30 years later, and we saw some quite enormous changes, transformations in the country. To start out with, we noticed there were 400 million new people in Delhi, and our High Commission, to which we returned the very same building, had really basically doubled in size. And at the time we were there, roughly 1,000 people either lived or visited the High Commission every day. So it is a hugely important bilateral relationship, which in terms of the pace of change and developments in India also changed dramatically in terms of the issues that we dealt with, some of which we were totally new in terms of substance, subject matter issues such as counterterrorism, the environment, science and technology, infrastructure, education, health research. All of these were very new issues that we have not had on the bilateral agenda before. So we're very delighted to have you here to enlighten us on some of these very new developments in India. The High Commissioner is a career diplomat, having joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1972, which must have been a good year since that's when we joined as well. After obtaining a master's degree in economics, he has held senior level appointments in the Indian Ministry of Commerce as well as the Ministry of External Affairs. He's had foreign postings in Moscow 2 times, Washington, Belgrade, Bangkok, Goa, Warsaw, and Kuala Lumpur. He has been India's ambassador to Qatar and Poland and High Commissioner in Malaysia. Mr. Narayan has been India's High Commissioner in Canada since the beginning of 2007. So I would like to welcome him again this afternoon, and I would invite you to give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Excellency, Brian, Anil Agarwal, other members of the friendship group. It's a great privilege for me to be here today, not least because of the venue, because I've spoken in many places, but speak in a library is it's almost like a holy place. I'm reminded of a line from Shakespeare when Hamlet says that I could be bound in a nutshell and count myself the king of infinite space. And I think as we come to the end of this long Canadian winter, for me and my wife, certainly one of the great delights of our post in Ottawa has been the fact that we live just a hop, skip, and jump away from the wonderful facility and the Ottawa Public Library in general. Everyone could not ask for a better place to be bound in a nutshell and see what's going on in the rest of the world. When Mrs. Kesarani and Mr. Agarwal came to me some months ago and asked me to speak to this group, I think we agreed that I would not speak on Indo-Canadian relations. I think many of you have heard me on Indo-Canadian relations, so we agreed that I would speak on another subject, which is democracy in India. its challenges, its prospects, and how India can be expected to face the many challenges which it faces. It is, of course, always said that India is the largest democracy in the world. What does this mean? In quantitative terms, it means an electorate of over 650 million voters. That was the last election. And the next election, which according to observers is not too far away now, will have an electorate which is even larger than that. Indeed, by definition, every election in India is by definition the largest democratic exercise ever conducted. We have, of course, 28 states. We have 7 union territories, and we have democratic institutions going down to the grassroots level, the village panchayats, local government. So at any given time, you have many elections going on in India. We have a full-time election commission, which is a constitutionally created body, which is tasked with the task of organizing elections, and it's constantly updating voter lists, preparing for elections, and so forth. What is also very interesting, when we are talking about the physical aspects of our election, is that our last election in 2004 was also a paperless election. The process of organizing an election takes about 6 weeks, the physical process, because we have to move people around from place to place, meet people on duty to conduct elections. But once the process was completed in 6 weeks, the counting took precisely half a day. The counting began after breakfast, and by lunchtime the results were announced, and the counters took the rest of the day off. So that, I think, was certainly a very great achievement. But apart from these physical dimensions of our democracy, I'd also like to talk a little bit about the qualitative aspects, what it really means to be in a democratic setup. And I'd like to take you back to a period which I think many of you may recall, a period in 1996 when we had a general election, and we had a hung parliament. Though the electorate did not give any party the absolute majority, and Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was asked by the president to form the government. He was given 2 weeks to do so, and on the 13th day after that, he spoke. He addressed the parliament. I was there in Delhi at that time. I recall that he spoke in the evening, and he made a speech. It was evident by the time that he had not been able to get a majority together, and he refused, of course, to do any prostrating and so on. And at the end of the speech, he said, I resigned, and he went straight from Parliament to Rashtrapati Bhavan, our President's house, put in his resignation. And that was then followed by a period of about 2 years when we had two so-called third front governments, one led by Mr. Devagowda, and then by my former boss, who was my ambassador in Moscow, Mr. I.K. Gujarat. And then in 1997, just about a year and a half or so, we had another general election. And that threw up yet another hung parliament. And Mr. Vajpayee and the BJP came to power at the head of a coalition government. They couldn't hold it together. And a year later, in 1998, government lost a vote of no confidence. That vote was lost by a single vote. And the reason the vote was lost was that Mayawati, who is today the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, a province a state with 160 million people, would be the 6th or 7th largest country in the world if it was independent. Mayawati, after promising support to the government, without warning, withdrew the support, and on the floor of the House, her party members voted against the government. And the government therefore fell, and we had a third general election in a period of 2 years, or thereabouts. So that indeed is what we have been through in qualitative terms as a democracy. And of course, there were many people at the time. I remember reading many pessimistic accounts of what would happen to Indian democracy if we were moving from we moved from one-party system to a two-party system, and then moved to a multi-party system, and whether we would be able to sustain our democracy. So and indeed it was perhaps the worst of times, but it was also the best of times, because we had 3 general elections, yes, but we had a situation where in a House of 528, I don't remember, that's the maximum strength of the House, I don't know how many there were at that time, but in a House of 528, Mr. Vajpayee lost by 1 vote. And I can guarantee you that in 90% of democracies, that would not have been the end of the matter. Mr. Vajpayee refused to do any prostrating. He did not, for instance, call in the army chief. And, he did not sort of review the situation as as Fagan did. He just, when he lost, he just resigned. He just drove from Parliament House to the President's house, which is next door, put in his resignation. So that is, I think, the quality of Indian democracy, because we have systemic stability. We have a system in which everybody believes. Power is handed over. Governments come and go through the ballot box. We have, of course, situational instability. When you look at the situation in India at any point of time, it's full of disequilibrium. It's full of situations which are cause for concern. But I think the important fact overlaid on all this, and in fact the essential strength of India, is that we have a systemic stability. I would like to tackle a little bit about how we have evolved, where we have come from, and where we are today in 2008. In 1947, when we became independent, we were indeed very lucky to be led by a leader, Mahatma Gandhi, who was more of a saint than a politician. And in fact, that's the aspect which Einstein invoked when he said that generations to come would scarce believe that such a being walked among us in flesh and blood. And because we were lucky to be led by such a person, we gained independence through entirely new instruments of satyagraha, non-violence, civil disobedience. Satyagraha, of course, literally means truth, struggle. And of course, it was, one should also give credit to the other side. That the British Empire was of a level of sophistication which responded to this kind of this kind of struggle, and which in fact gave us independence in a peaceful way. So we were able to avoid some of the violence struggles which have preceded independence in other countries. But of course, if India was conceived in the nursery of non-violence, it was born in the very violent crucible of partition that we could not avoid. And of course, while it is easy when you think of the British Empire, the level of sophistication, the marching bands, the brass knuckles, and so on and so forth. It is easy to think of the transition to independence for India and Pakistan and Bangladesh as a very smooth process. In fact, Shakespeare says of a character in Macbeth that nothing in his life came him like the living. And sometimes we tend to think that of the British Empire. Now that, of course, may have been true of the way in which the British left India. Certainly they did not leave on the back of a helicopter from the top of an embassy building. But what was left behind was utter chaos, because outside of the two world wars, perhaps partition resulted in a greater human tragedy and trauma, no even to the 20th century, resulted in such displacement of populations, 3 million people killed. Of course, I think we have all heard those stories about these trains filled with bodies coming into each country, India, Pakistan. So on the one hand, we had this very enlightened leadership in India, Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, others. Very enlightened, very educated leadership, which had sacrificed, which was absolutely selfless, informed by high ideals, pure idealism. And on the other hand, of course, was a reality of India: poverty, illiteracy, communalism. Between the ideal and the realization always falls the shadow. And I think that was epitomized in a very real way by Jawaharlal Nehru making that very famous speech about the tryst with destiny at midnight on 15th August. While Mahatma Gandhi was not in Delhi, after independence was not in Delhi, he was in fact in Noakhali in Bengal, trying to stem the bloodbath which had already begun. So those really were the circumstances. And superimposed on that was a vast diversity of India. I think in Canada, we talk of multiculturalism. But India is perhaps it's the second most populous, but it's certainly the most diverse nation on earth. And I would like to, I think this audience, of course, knows most of what I'm going to say, but I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about the kind of diversity which we have in India. We'll begin perhaps with religious diversity. We have in India is the birthplace of at least 4 major religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism. We have exogenous religions. Practically all exogenous religions have existed in India, have come to India almost at the very moment of their birth. Our encounter with Islam is well over a millennium old. Of course, people tend to think of Islam as coming to India by conquest from the 10th century onwards, from Mahmud al-Ghazni, 10th century, Muhammad Ghori, 12th century, the fearsome Timur, 14th century till the Mughals, the great Mughals established their empire in the 16th century. But in fact, Islam came to India far earlier. It came through traders from Arabia. And the first mosque in India was built in 612 during the lifetime of the Prophet. I remember going to Yemen some years ago and being told by one of the ministers as to how the Yemeni traders in the old days used to get into their dhows and steer without benefit of compass and without benefit, of course, of an engine for many days and weeks and sometimes months. And then finally, if they were lucky, they would sight land. And they would then give thanks to God. They would say, Khair Allah. And then he looked at me and said, you know, that's the origin of where you come from, Kerala. So that is our encounter with Islam. Christianity is the third largest religion in India. It came to India in AD 44 with the apostle St. Thomas. We have many dimensions of Christianity in India, some of which I think maybe perhaps you have not even heard of. Marthomites, Jacobites, Syrian Christians, and so on. Judaism arrived in India over 2,500 years ago. It came in antiquity. And it is thought that it came from Judea. But what is remarkable is that there is absolutely no trace of anti-Semitism in India. In fact, such anti-Semitism and persecution as the Jewish people suffered in India came not from Indians, but from the Portuguese. We have, of course, the Parsis who came to India over 1,000 years ago. And there was, of course, this very wonderful story about the Parsis who came from Persia, from Iran. And they laid anchor, down anchor somewhere near Mumbai, Bombay. And the king, that place, thought he already had enough people, enough subjects, and he didn't really want to receive additional guests. So he is said to have sent them a pitcher of milk, which was brimmed, filled to the brim, to signify that there was no room at the inn, so to speak. And the leader of the Parsis is supposed to have taken a spoonful of sugar and dissolved it in the milk without spilling it over, and sent it back to signify that there would, in fact, there was room in the inn. There's always room at the inn, and that they would in fact sweeten the life of the people. And that, of course, was the beginning of the story, which is still carrying on with Chorus and the Tata Nano. And my head of Chancellery was just reminding me the other day, he said that we should now get rid of our office cars and replace them, as he said, with our cars. So our, we have huge amount of diversity. We have ethnic diversity. If you look at people from Kerala, if you look at people from the north, if you look at people from the northeast, the racial differences are pretty obvious. India has been formed by successive waves of immigrants who came either as conquerors or as traders from Central Asia, from Europe, from Arabia. We have descendants of Alexander the Great in India. There is in fact a tradition that Jesus Christ spent part of those 40 years when he was wandering the desert, that part of it he spent in Kashmir. So we have huge amount of diversity, as Pandit Nehru said. He likened India to a palimpsest on which successive generations of Indians had written their stories, but had not obliterated what one went before. And I'd like to end this with a quotation from Shashi Tharoor, who is a very clever person, and also from my college, like someone else who's sitting there. And Shashi says the idea of India is a one land embracing many. It is the idea that a nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, conviction, culture, cuisine, costume, and custom, and still rally around a consensus. And that consensus is around the simple idea that in a democracy you don't really need to agree, except on the ground rules of how you're going to disagree. So that, in fact, is the story of India. And in this milieu of partition, the post-partition trauma, this milieu of poverty, of illiteracy, of communalism, of diversity so vast as to be almost incomprehensible. It is in this milieu that in 1950, we in India gave to ourselves a constitution which declared ourselves a sovereign democratic republic. Now we talk about the audacity of hope today, and that in fact is audacity, because India had not been sovereign, let's face it, for many thousands of years. India had not been a unified country. We had a lot of cultural continuity in India, going back 2,500 years to the time of Buddha and before. You can draw a line of continuity between, say, Buddha, Ashoka, Akbar, Gandhi, in terms of ideas. But in terms of political continuity, quite unlike, for example, China, which for 2,500 years had been ruled as a single unit, India had no tradition of being a unified country. And in fact, when the British left India, India was not a unified country, although we tend to think that it was, because the unification, there were 600 Indian states that were from British India, 600 plus, and the unification of India was a very important, very delicate task, which consumed our nation builders in the initial years of our independence. That was, of course, sovereign. Then to call ourselves democratic, again, we really had very little tradition of democracy. Of course, it is true that if you go back to the Rig Veda and so on, you do find quotations which imply that people used to sit down in a very Athenian sort of way and discuss matters and come to a decision. But the fact is that in terms of our history in India, recent history, it's very difficult to see India as democratic. And finally, of course, a republic. It had again not been a republic. It had either been ruled by a king, or a Maharaja, or by a distant emperor sitting across the ocean. So it was, I think, a stretch, and it was certainly a visionary document to adopt a constitution which called for the establishment of a sovereign democratic republic in India. And I think the greatest achievement in India in the last 60 years or so has been that we have stuck to those ideals. Today, we are sovereign, we are proudly sovereign, sometimes uncomfortably sovereign. We are democratic, we are the argumentative Indian, we are, our democracy is vibrant, it's practiced. When you're inside it, sometimes you feel you're in a pressure cooker. but we are democratic, and we will certainly remain so. And of course, we are a republic. We were, of course, the first country to enter the Commonwealth without acknowledging the Queen as a head of state, and we continue on that path. Where do we go from here? I mean, certainly, when you look at what India has come through, what we've achieved, one can distinguish in some way between, let's say, the last 15 years and the previous 40 or 45 years. Previously, we did have a, if you will, a socialist form of government, the commanding heights were controlled by the state. And then, of course, in the early 90s, we faced crises of many dimensions. One, of course, was the fact that our growth rate had stagnated, it was stuck. We were really not growing. We were growing at what is called the Hindu rate of growth, 3.5–4%. That was just not enough to meet the expectations of the Indian people. The world had changed. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and that indeed was. I was in Moscow during that period, and it was a very traumatic period for us because, in many ways, our relation with the Soviet Union was a very close relationship. It was, of course, not by any means a relationship in the alliance, but we did have political linkages. We had economic linkages, extensive economic linkages. We had military linkages, defense linkages with the Soviet Union. And that certainly was a matter of concern. And of course, we passed through a very serious foreign exchange crisis when our foreign exchange reserves were down to about 3 weeks of imports, and we had to physically actually shift gold abroad to keep our economy going. So we did come through a crisis, and of course we responded to it through liberalization, through embracing globalization rather than running away from it. And of course the rest of the story is well known. Our present Prime Minister was the Finance Minister at that time, and I think a great deal of credit for what we are today must go to him. And we shifted gears. We essentially shifted gears from a Hindu rate of growth to a tiger rate of growth, if you will. We managed 8% and more over the last 10 years. The last 3 or 4 years, it's even been higher than that. But what has really changed, apart from these numbers and figures and so on, what has really changed is the mindset of mindset of the Indian population. Today, you have an India which is confident of itself. You have an India which is young. 54% of our population is below the age of 25. And 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, that would have been considered a huge minus point, a huge disadvantage. We were then reared on markers and theories of population growth and theories of brain drain, how it's all going to, how the whole edifice would come crashing down on our heads one day and so on, if we did not stop population growth, did not stop the subdivision of agricultural land, and so on. Today, our population is considered as an asset because we look at our people as people who will contribute as consumers, who will contribute as producers, who will contribute their creativity, their energy. And that certainly is a sea change in what has happened. And to give just one example of that from very recent history, we beat Australia in Australia. And I can tell you, tossing that out is a matter of great pride for me. You can talk about the Tata Nano, but beating Australia in Australia is something else. So I think that is our great strength. Of course, we face many challenges as we look to the future. We cannot obviously rest on our laurels. There are many problems. Some of them, of course, are very well known. The problem of infrastructure. We lack roads, we lack power, we lack communications. The problem of education, primary education particularly. We have some institutions, universities, which are the best of the best. You cannot hope for better institutions. We have, for example, the IITs, the IIMs, and I remember Mr. Narayan, the founder of Infosys, saying 3 or 4 years ago, he said, I sent my daughter to MIT because she couldn't get admission to the IIT. So that's that's a new India. That's the self-confidence which we have. But we also have to face the fact that in terms of primary education, we have many miles to go. We cannot simply say that we have free compulsory education in India. Yes, we have many government schools, but when you go to the rural areas, you find schools without teachers, people who don't turn up. You find many problems. But we also have many schemes. For example, the midday meal scheme, which has been extremely successful in bringing kids to school. And I think the problems which we face can really be summed up in just one word, and that word is empowerment. We need to empower large sections of our population. We need to empower women. We have empowered women, I think, in a very real way since, for example, the 70s, when under Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, we passed a law at the village level, at the grassroots, local self-government levels, 1/3 of seats would be reserved for women. And I remember at that time there was much scoffing and much cynical comment of this. And people said that, well, things will never change. The guy will put his wife or her sister there, and she will be his mouthpiece, and she will say exactly what he wants, and things will never change in India. Well, they did put their wives, but things did change, because once the wives got into positions of power, after some time, they realized, I think all husbands here realize all too well. has changed. That has changed India in many ways. And of course, the next step is to bring that in Parliament, the last bastion. And we've had a situation where all parties support the idea of 1/3 reservation of seats in Parliament for women, but somehow it never happens. But you know, those other things, I think that will happen. So we need to empower women. We need to empower our illiterate, uneducated people. We need to empower farmers. We need to empower many, many sections of our society. I think as in India, we've been very good at creating democratic systems, at creating a system which ensures that everybody's voice has a chance to be heard. But we have not been very good at trickle down, as they call it. We have not been very good at ensuring that the benefits of growth, the benefits of development, in fact, percolate down to the poorest. And I think, again, Gandhiji put it very succinctly and very clearly when he said that it's our task to wipe every tear from every eye. We have not been very good at that. But certainly, we have a system which can deliver. We have a system which can ensure that everybody's voice is heard. We have a system. We have a democratic system, a political system, political pluralism, through which I think these things matter. Because we had the last election in India, 2004. The government delivered a very high growth rate. In fact, I remember the last quarter before the election, the growth rate was 10.4%. We really reached Chinese rate of growth, 10.4%. And they went to the electorate on the with the slogan of Shining India and so on, and they lost. So that I think is, and no government can take the electorate for granted. And I think that's our real strength. I'm asked many times about India and China, and how we see the prospects for India and China. And of course, there are many theories about this. There are many books on this. Friedman, world is flat, and how India as a tortoise will overtake the hare, and so on and so forth. But for me, I think when I look at India, the Indian experience, we have been through everything. We started with partition, we've been through famine, we've been through communal riots, we've been through civil disturbance, we've been through violent so-called people's war groups, the Naxalite movement, we've been through unstable governments, we've been through successive elections in 2 years, 3 years, and so on. And I think today we have reached a level of maturity because of that. We have confidence in our system, and that I think, so despite all the situational instability, and there is a lot of situational instability, and that will continue in India, because we are a dynamic, developing economy. We have many conflicting interests. We have many people who feel aggrieved, who feel they have not got their due from the system, and so the conflicts of interest will continue. But we have a system for resolving these issues, and I think that is our real strength, and that I think is what gives me and what gives Indians everywhere confidence, optimism to hope that the 21st century will definitely be our century. And let me end with what one of my colleagues at the diplomatic service said just the other day. He compared democracy to water. And he said that just as water can exist in many forms, democracy exists also in many forms. Sometimes it's cold and hard as ice. If you don't vote for the proper person, you will find it on your back. And sometimes it's like water. The lowest common denominator finding its own level. Sometimes it's like vapor, as insubstantial as vapor. I mean, then it is really the stuff of which dreams are made of. And sometimes, of course, it's beautiful, pure, pristine, and as pervasive and never-ending as your beautiful white song. It covers every inch of this beautiful country. But and sometimes it's like a river. I mean, the water flows very slowly. It's turgid, slow-moving. It flows in established channels. Sometimes it bursts its banks, and as we just noticed in a neighboring country, we've had a wonderful eruption of democracy, and so I think in India also, democracy is like water. It's necessary for our survival. It's part of our DNA, if you will. And I don't know where we will go from here, from India. But what I do know is that whatever we do, wherever we go, we will do it with the consent of the people of India. The decisions will be made not outside India. The decisions will be made not even in Delhi, not even in the state capitals, but they will be made in thousands of towns, in hundreds of thousands of villages, and in millions of families all over India. And I think that is what gives us the confidence to face the future. Thank you very much. I hope I've not taken too much time.
Mr. Narayan, a number of people would like to ask you questions.
Okay.
Mr. Mukherjee, if you want to get started.
First of all, let tell me, it's very moving to hear you give us that confidence, those of us of Indian origin for now in Canada. I wonder if I shouldn't go and return. No, quite seriously, there is a dimension of India of which I am very personally proud, that there has been all of the religious traditions welcomed and holding together in India. I always say to my wife, who is Jewish, how proud I am that in India there was no persecution. The one country. My question is, what is India doing vis-a-vis the very man that we have kept there in great pride, respect, His Holiness Dalai Lama? What is India going to do about this vis-a-vis China? Is this an issue that is significant? How much of that is democratic?
Well, I think we have already, I really don't get the question, because Dalai Lama has been living in India for the last 50 plus years. He's always been welcome in India. He is a revered spiritual leader. And there are a lot of people in India who look after him. In fact, I think it's fair to say that practically everyone in India, regardless of religious orientation, looks up to the Dalai Lama. But if your question is a political question as to what we are going to do vis-a-vis what is happening in Tibet and so on, surely it is also a question to be addressed to many other countries of the world. It's not really a question to be to be addressed by India. As far as we are concerned, the Dalai Lama is a revered spiritual leader. We respect him, we honor him as such. But we've always made it clear that as far as the political aspects go, we recognize Tibet as a part of China. And that's where it stands.
Okay, thank you.
There's another question there.
I guess I'm over G-star energy. So the question I have, Your Excellency, is something related to the administration of India. You know, you said a lot of things about the democracy, but you know, the continuation of so-called Indian civil service, the ICFC, basically non-Indian, non-civil, and as John said, didn't know much of service. And that system, which is continuing, does it have enough capability, or I would say the management know-how, or whatever it takes, to fight against the primary education problems, the law and order, and also which related to the health problems, including family planning?
Well, to begin with, let me say we did away with Indian civil service. Soon after independence, we don't have that anymore. But you know, look, every government needs, every country needs a civil service. You can't really do without that. Now, it is true that the Indian civil service has suffered from shortcomings, but also it is a service which is perhaps more commented upon, more introspected upon than most other services. And I would say, at the risk of being immodest, that at the higher echelons, at the officer level, the Indian administrative service is a very fine service. People work very hard. People at very young ages, they are thrown into the deep end. They have to deal with huge problems of development, of poverty, of illiteracy, problems which perhaps in a developed country like Canada, you don't really face at all. But it is also true that at the other end, the lower end of the service, there are problems. There are problems of corruption. There are problems associated with the misuse of power and so on and so forth. But let me say this, that in the last 10 or 15 years, we have changed the system. You know, we have moved from the license permit Raj, the old thing, to essentially a market-oriented system, where it's really the market signals which control most of the economic decisions. So to that extent, the scope for corruption, has gone down. Now that's of course not to say, in terms of Transparency International and so on, India still has a long way to go, and there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that there is corruption in the system. Partly it is because it is what one could attribute to the developing country syndrome, that we are a developing country, people are poor, they do have needs which are still unmet, and therefore they resort to some of these aspects. But and hopefully things have changed in the last 10 or 15 years, and hopefully they will continue to change for the better.
Are there other questions people have? Mr. Kepler?
I thought we might be a journey for tea. So just two quick comments rather than a question. The first is in regard to what was just heard. I just wish I could be in my class every year. Most of us have been following India and talking about India for a long time and do nothing but take pleasure in what we see before us. Just on all the various bases that you touched. But I wanted to raise a totally different subject for my second comment. That is since this is a Canada-India friendship circle, that I think we should note that a great friend of Canada, from Canada, of India, has died in the last short time. Jeff Pearson has passed away. And, there are people in the room who know him far better than I, who work with him. I once conspired with the Honorable Flora MacDonald and with Jeff to get Carleton to re-enter Shastri, the Canadian Institute. When he came over to campus, we had let our membership lapse, a fit of absent-mindedness. And we worked very hard on our President Van Loon, putting somebody from Queens on one side. But I just thought others may all want to contribute to that. But I can tell you, knowing him personally, he remained forever influenced by his time in India as a great friend.
Thank you. Patricia, you had a question?
Just a quick one. I imagine you have noticed the amount of time people spend worrying about Afghanistan, Canada and Afghanistan, which is a very long way away. What preoccupies India's view of Afghanistan?
Well, you know, with Afghanistan, we have civilizational links. You know, I mean, if you look at history, Afghanistan was always at the fulcrum, you know, between the Mughals and the Persian Empire. So we have civilizational links to Afghanistan, and so after Afghanistan was you know, the Taliban was driven out, and we had a democratic government in Afghanistan. We've been very heavily engaged in Afghanistan, not in a military way, but in terms of reconstruction, in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of training of civil servants, you know, and many, many other ways. We've been very heavily engaged. And I think our objective is exactly the same as that of Canada. We would like to see a democratic Afghanistan. So in that sense, we've been following the debate in Canada very closely. And we do think that any precipitate withdrawal from Afghanistan, I'm not saying that Canada is going to do that, but we do think that that would be a matter of great concern to us. If there's any resurgence of Taliban, our history has shown that you can't really contain these things in Afghanistan. It will spread you know, to other countries. And you know, we certainly would like to see Afghanistan get back on its feet and get back in a democratic way.
You had a question?
Yes, my name is Kabir Said. I come from southern India, Madras in particular, now called Chennai. I was going on one of the fora which was discussed in India, it's called the India Thinkers Forum. And I heard that some time back that there's a conflict brewing between India and China on the northeastern side. I think near Assam and from the north of that, where China has encroached upon Indian territory up to 20 kilometers or so. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I think this has been discussed in Parliament recently. You know, of course, that China claims Arunachal Pradesh as its territory. And I think we've made some statements saying that yes, there have been some incursions, you know, from the other side. But it's certainly not a conflict situation. It's a very manageable situation. In fact, we just had a visit by Hu Jintao to India, which was very successful. And we in India look at our relations with China essentially, you know, certainly as a success story. In the last 10 or 15 years, we have made great strides in you know, we have a normal relationship now, and trade has increased manyfold. China today is our largest, I think second largest trading partner. It has increased very rapidly. So the picture essentially is a positive one as far as India and China are concerned. Of course, there may be, as you said, you know, things happen. Yeah.
See, I'd like to ask you a question which I shouldn't. But
because of having been to India so often and having followed its political situation over the years, I continue to be very interested in that aspect. And one of the things that I find about India at the present time, as opposed to almost any other country I can think of which claims to have a democratic rule, is that with most other countries, including my own, there's lots of questions about the leadership. You know, you can look at the United States, you can look at France, Britain, Canada, you name it. I never hear any kind of speculation about the Prime Minister of India. It seems to me that certainly from outside India, he's very highly respected. Is there any kind of feeling within India that we don't seem to get? I mean, is he going to be able to stay on forever? Is there anybody waiting in the wings to replace him? I mean, we just don't see that same kind of questions raised about the leadership currently in place in India.
Well, you know, when I was High Commissioner to Malaysia before, Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh came to Malaysia, and so I got somebody to introduce him, Malaysian, Ajit Singh, who used to be Secretary General of ASEAN, and he got up and said that you know, he is the most highly qualified Prime Minister in the world. And I was very happy because after that the visit went very smoothly. And well, I am a bit of a fan of Dr. Manmohan Singh because he was my professor. He taught me international trade at the Delhi School of Economics in 1969. And of course, I think it's very well acknowledged that he is the architect of the turnaround which we have seen in India. He is very well acknowledged that he's a very sound person, a very committed, very dedicated person. And I think, despite all the political heat which has been generated in India, for example, because of the single U.S. nuclear deal, and there has been a lot of different opinions as to what should be done and so on. But I think Dr. Manmohan Singh's personal integrity, his personal commitment, has never been questioned, to my knowledge, by anyone. So indeed, we are very lucky to have to have a person like him.
I think there was a question at the back there.
Your Excellency, my name is Dr. Narayan. I'm also from the South. I think Canada, like India, is such a peaceful, multicultural, multi-religious country. And yet, unfortunately, we see so much instability in the world. And the war on is being pursued as a war on religion, unfortunately. And I really think religion is not a major influence in terrible calamities that we have seen recently. For example, in Rwanda and Burundi, 1 million Tutsis were killed by Hutus, and they are both Catholic and both Africans. There is a civil war raging in Somalia. They are both Africans, they are both Muslim. The war in Sri Lanka had nothing to do with religion, between Hindu Tamils and the Brother Sinhalese. It's probably a legacy of colonialism. And in the Balkans, besides tremendous bloodshed, and Muslims were being sort of made partners together, but unfortunately that is not true, because the Orthodox Serbs were as vicious with the Catholic Croats as they were with the Muslims. So really, none of these calamities was an influence. So how can India help resolve this great debate about erratic influence of religion? Because as you correctly said, India is the home, India is the motherland of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. And of course, it's a home to Islam. See, I'm being a Muslim minority myself. I know there are 160 million Muslims in India, probably the second largest Muslim minority in the world. How can India help to resolve this terrible schism between democracy and religion?
Well, I think firstly, I don't agree with you that it's being pursued as a war on religion, the war terror. There are, of course, many many theories about this, and some of the things which we are seeing are really very unfortunate. Like these cartoons and so on and so forth. This video, whatever it is, posted on the internet. But those, to my mind, are basically aberrations. And I think this whole theory of clash of civilizations, which is perhaps the theoretical underpinning of all this kind of speculation, that I think is not is not sustainable, because a clash of civilization is an oxymoron. I mean, if you are civilized, you don't clash. And if you clash, then obviously, but that's an aside. But really, I think yes. I mean, there are certain aspects, certain religious aspects have come to the forefront that have been scrutinized, and there is. You can't really speak for all the people. I mean, people have different attitudes. People have different levels of consciousness, of awareness, of education. But I think essentially at the political level, the war on terror is a war on terror. I mean, it's really very little to do with the religion at bottom. And I think as far as India is concerned, I mean, we have internalized diversity in India. It really doesn't matter if a person is a Hindu or a Muslim or whatever. I mean, that's secondary to you are judged to be the person you are. And as to how we can help, I think we are doing whatever we can in India. We are an example, hopefully, of democracy, an example of how to harmonize, diversity, huge religious diversities which we have in India. Certainly, if a society which is as diverse as India, ethnically, religiously, in so many other dimensions, if a society like that can remain as an entity, can progress as an entity, can develop, then certainly there is hope for the entire world. And one cannot really think that differences of religion would derail civilization.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Raju Agrawal. My question pertains to socialism and democracy. The people in extreme poverty, the Indian electorate, basically have been electing these socialist parties because they provide temporary relief for poverty. Do you believe that the Indian electorate will eventually elect parties that are offering a sustainable path to development, or will they continue to elect? Even right now, they're saying that the Communist Party is going to withdraw support and come to power on its own, the left front. So, what's your thoughts on that?
I'm not one of those who would really demonize, the left parties, the communists. They have a role to play. I mean, they are highly educated people. For one thing, they are people who have stayed outside government, so they have not accepted the loaves and fishes of office. They have preferred to influence, and whatever they say is an ideological basis. I mean, they believe in what they say. It's not, it's not a cynical political process. So, and I think they do provide a balance. At the end of the day, we may not like it. We may not like what they're saying. In terms of X, Y, Z, in terms of the Indo-US nuclear deal, and so on and so forth. But they do provide a balance because they speak to certain sections, disempowered, disenfranchised sections of the population. And so they do bring a sense of balance, to the and of course, they have accepted the ballot box. our communists fight elections. And that is an essential difference between them and and communists in other parts of the world. It's not the the Communist Party is supreme, and no other party is allowed to exist, and so on. So I think to that extent they have a role to play, they'll go to the electorate along with all the other parties as and when we have elections. If they're elected, well, so be it. Then we have to listen to what they say.
Just one follow-up question. I want to ask you about agriculture. On the one hand, food prices are skyrocketing. On the other hand, farmers are committing suicide. You know the reasons for that? You can shed some light on that.
Well, I think we've had what we call the Green Revolution in India in the 70s. And that was certainly a huge success. It lifted India from one level of development to the other, in the sense that before that we were really dependent on food imports, then we became self-sufficient in food exports and so on. But what has really happened is that we need another Green Revolution. There has not been, the technological breakthroughs which are needed for that have not really happened. The price of food has increased, because of global factors. Those are well known. Part of that is the fact that people in India and China are consuming more, and that's essentially a good thing, because these are people who are traditionally, historically malnourished, undernourished, and therefore that's something which we should welcome, which we should deal with. And of course, if you look at this last budget, there are huge plus points as far as farmers are concerned. And of course, it's people say it is because it's an election budget. Fine, but the point is that that's precisely the point of democracy. That you have to listen to people who are disadvantaged, because what goes around comes around, and if you don't listen to them, then you may have an unpleasant surprise, at the elections. So that is exactly the corrective, process of democracy.
We have got to ask Dr. Pandey for the last question, and then I'm sure Mr. Narayan will stay here to answer some more.
My curiosity is about Indo-US nuclear deal. Two questions. Number one, do you think it will go through? Number two, if it does, do you think it will be advantageous to our country?
Well, I think it's easier for me to answer the second one. Yes, absolutely. It will be very advantageous for India. We need it in India because essentially what we are trying to do is two things. One is, of course, trying to get out of this nuclear non-proliferation box in which we are currently. The second is that we are trying to access energy, nuclear energy, because at the moment we have around 3% of our energy is coming from nuclear sources. We want to increase that to 15 to 16%. We will eventually do that. Whether the nuclear deal goes through or not, we will access nuclear energy, but it will take time because we have to go the current cycle, essentially to the thorium cycle, because we have to do the thorium. But that will take time for us to do that. So instead of reinventing the wheel, this would be, this would give us access to the nuclear technology, uranium, and so on and so forth. The deal is not, clearly it's not about non-proliferation, because it's not about how to build the atomic bomb, because we have that. It's not about non-proliferation, because our record of non-proliferation is absolutely impeccable. So it is essentially about energy, and I think that paradigm has to be shifted, has to be seen in that light. As to whether it will go through, I think that's that's a more difficult question, because I think you're privy to whatever's coming on the from the news and the TV channels and so on. The CPM is just having its annual meeting, party congress, and they've just reiterated again that there is no give on this. But if you ask me, I think yes, it will go through. I still feel cautiously optimistic about it.
Our Prime Minister is very optimistic about it.
Well, he is committed to it, and certainly the government is very much committed to it. And I have a feeling that it should go through in the end.
Then what advantage does it have to America that it is so much interested in having nuclear deal with India? And
well, I think there are advantages, because firstly, it will differentiate India from other countries which have taken the nuclear option, exercised the nuclear option. And I think that's something which is a recognition of India as as a democracy, is a recognition of India as a responsible power. That is one. Then, of course, there are commercial advantages to the US. Those are not to be seized at. But also, in a very fundamental sense, the world is looking at an ecological environmental crisis. And in order to tackle that crisis, you have to tackle some of these big-ticket issues. You have to see how India, China can access the energy which they need for their growth. It's self-evident that our growth, we are not going to curb our growth because we don't have access to energy. Because we have coal in India, we have huge reserves of coal after 300 years. It's very dirty coal, it's high soda ash coal. But that's precisely what is happening today in both China and India. That pollution levels are going up, carbon emissions are going up. And of course in India, I mean, we are looking at a mix. For example, we are today number 4 in terms of wind power. We use a lot of solar power. But the hard fact is that those technologies do not, at today's technological levels, provide the answer. They will not yield the kind of energy which we need. So we have to look at the nuclear energy in the mix. And I think that's something which hopefully the US has realized as well. Because I mean, we are all on this earth together, and whatever happens is going to affect everyone. And what's happening is certainly not very comforting.
Well, Your Excellency, Mr. Narayan, thank you for painting a picture of India and its diversity. Diversity in terms of its ethnicity, culture, language, religion, governance structures. A country which is a success as a democracy because of its value systems, its democratic underpinnings and institutions, which has realized a vision of peaceful coexistence, and which is well on its path to individual and collective empowerment. And I'm confident, we are all confident, that it will enable it to realize a vision of prosperity for all. On behalf of all my colleagues on the board of directors of ICFC, I'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation. Thank you so much.